everybody, it's RoyJo coming at you with a brand new video, and we're about to shift into a very interesting meta come the release of Phantom Nightmare in just a couple of weeks as of this video going up. With cards like Snake Eyes Populace and Promethean Princess coming out of the set, it looks like we're going to be seeing a very straightforward meta, at least in terms of the top decks, especially with the release of cards like Bonfire and Transaction Rollback in Maze of Millennia just a couple of weeks prior. This of course means a massive shift in the actual playstyle and deck building sense of the format, and that will of course include staple cards. With that in mind though, it's been a good while since I've made a video on hand traps or board breaker tier lists, and so what better way to refresh my knowledge on the cards of the format than to get a massive sample size for it. I've taken 23 decks that have topped or won regionals in the past couple of weeks as of the new format starting up just before Phantom Nightmare, and I will be compiling that plus the speculation coming from Phantom Nightmare on what the meta will shape up to be like in order to get my best estimate on what will be the best hand traps going into Phantom Nightmare format. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into my hand trap tier list for the February 2024 format post Phantom Nightmare. Starting off, of course, we have Ash Blossom, always going to be the poster child of hand traps as a whole, and would you believe that out of the 23 decks that I sampled, only one deck wasn't playing Ash Blossom, and that was a Drytron list that was playing mostly Engine. This actually comes to a bit of a surprise to me given that cards like Triple Tactics, Talent, and Thrust are really big in this format, but honestly I think it's just completely worth it, because Ash is just such a powerful card when it comes to shutting down decks that like to use their deck, especially when it comes to special summoning, and we have a lot of those in the format between decks like Rescue Ace with Emergency, Unchained with, well, everything in the deck, and it's even really good against decks like Fire King because you can hit things like Ponix without having to target them and risk dodging it by a Circle or Kirin or even Skyburn. Ash is actually going to become even more powerful going into the next format, because when we think of the next format post Phantom Nightmare, the main decks we think about are Snake Eyes / Fire King variants, and of course Labyrinth due to Transaction Rollback. And Ash is just very, very powerful against both of those decks. Against Lab, it's pretty obvious, hitting things like the Welcome, Big Welcome, things like that. Unless they have Rollback, they're not really going to be able to make a comeback from that, as we've seen with Lab before Rollback coming out. And then when it comes to the Snake Eyes Fire King stuff, basically everything in the deck is ashable. I mean, to be fair, you're not going to want to ash like Wanted or anything, but you can ash the original Sinful Spoil Snake Eye, you can ash the Snake Eye monsters themselves trying to special from deck, you can ash the Populace, you can ash the Bonfire that's attempting to add the Populace, and of course you can ash like half of the main strategy points of Fire King. There's just very little that Ash doesn't hit going into the next format, and because of this, I'm going to put it in the high impact category. Again, you might have to watch out for cards like Thrust and Talents because they are very popular and very powerful, but I think that Thrust is actually slightly less powerful going into the next format because board breakers are very difficult to actually utilize. Cards like Dark Ruler and such and Evenly Matched haven't really been as powerful since the release of cards like SP and the introduction of mostly decks that want to use monsters, back row, cards in hand, cards in grave. They're just way too much to keep track of for to reliably use cards like Dark Ruler. And so because of this, Ash is going to be the first hand trap in the high impact category. Next on the list we have Bystials, and out of the 23 decks that I sampled, about 6 decks were running Bystials in a varying amount of packages. Some people were on like 2 Drunosaur and 1 Magnemite, some people were on heftier packages like things along the lines of like Ball Drake and everything like that, and then one or two lists of course were playing like the Lubellion because they were actually playing it as Engine. And because of this, I think it's a bit fair to say that Bystials go in the situational category. They're pretty solid against Lab, don't get me wrong. Like, you can hit the furniture pieces in Graveyard, or you can even hit the Lovely or Lady out of grave when you know they're trying to special off the Big Welcome. Very, very strong there. Helps you get a lot of advantage. Not to mention, of course, if you're playing a deck like maining Bystials, such as Bystial Runic and stuff, it's going to be really good in those decks. However, playing against a deck like the Fire King Snake Eye stuff, it's not going to do literally anything. And then it's mainly after that just trying to hit like a bunch of different rogue or lower tier decks that are trying to like crawl their way up. And so Bystials, if your deck can utilize them really well, again, like I said, I was sampling decks, it was mostly decks like Dragon Link, Bestial Runic, Vanquish Soul, stuff like that. Things that would already natively play Bestials because they actually work well with their engine. I think if they can work well with your engine, absolutely. They are, again, pretty solid against Lab, at least, but against, like, the Fire King, Snake Eyes stuff, I really wouldn't recommend siding it in. So next on our list is going to be DD Crow, and DD Crow actually had a shockingly low representation of only 5 decks actually playing it. And I think that's pretty interesting because there's a big argument between playing Crow or Bell or even both, because both of them work against roughly the same things, but there are a few arguments to be had for each card. DD Crow is not once per turn, which means drawing multiples is actually really solid. Not to mention that it's a bit more generic in terms of its usage because Bell requires like specifically 3 different things to be going off. DD Crow, for example, can hit things like Bestial Lubellium before it has a chance to special summon itself, and things like that. However, DD Crow being a dark means that it can be a target for Bestials, not to mention it's a lot harder to use against cards such as Fire King High Avatar Kirin, or things like that that can optionally special from graveyard or from hand, or there's multiple targets in the graveyard that could be summoned and you don't know which one to hit, or hitting only one would be not impactful if they can summon the other. And so I can kind of see where people are coming from. I still think Crow going into the next format is going to be very powerful though. You can use Crow to get rid of targets that would be targeted for like transaction rollback later in the turn. Like, for example, before they put rollback in grave by some means, you can, like, hit the big welcome or something. You can hit all the furniture pieces, of course, which is a really big thing. And you can hit, like, again, like, a bunch of the stuff in the Snake Eye Fire King deck. Half the Snake Eyes cards, half the Fire King cards. And not to mention, you can, of course, hit the Promethean Princess in the graveyard. That's one of the big ones. However, again, Bell can hit some of these cards as well. And so it's kind of like based on whether or not your deck can really synergize with it compared to other decks, I suppose. For example, I'm playing Live Twin Runic Sprite. I'm going to be drawing a lot of cards, so I'd rather see cards that are not hard ones per turn if I'm drawing multiples. But I do believe it is up to player preference. Next on our list is Droll, and Droll had one of the highest rates of play at 15 out of 23 decks seeing it, and a lot of it was actually in the main as opposed to the side. And I think that Droll is pretty damn solid right now. You have a lot of decks like Monadium running around, and then just a lot of decks are going to be doing a lot of searching outside of the draw phase. And so I think Droll is very powerful right now. But how is it going into the next format? Well, I think it's a bit of a glass cannon because Droll can just completely shut down a Fire King player, a Fire King Snake Eyes player most of the time. Because yes, they will use the Wanted to search in the draw phase, but then if they go into main phase and go like Bonfire or something, congratulations, now they can't use Populous Effect or anything like that, or any of their other important searches such as Snake Eyes Ash, Ponix, etc., Fire King Island, even if they can end up probably on a small end board if you open just Droll. But on the other hand, if you play it against a deck like Lab, you're not going to really get any value out of it because Lab searches literally once in their entire turn, maybe twice if you count Extra or something. Even then, like the first search being Ariana isn't going to matter half the time anyway. So you're kind of like stuck in a 50-50 standstill. You don't know whether or not to main deck it or not. So at that point, I'd really just recommend putting Droll in the side deck. I think that Droll in the side is going to be pretty damn powerful. And like I said, I think it's such a really good card against Fire King Snake Eye. Even if they can play a little bit through it, it does stop a lot of their really explosive plays. So I'm going to put it in the high impact category. Again, I just think it's really good against that deck in particular, which is going to make it very represented, I should say, and just very strong overall, even if it's mostly like a side deck choice in my opinion. Next on our list is going to be Shifter, and Shifter had about 5 different spots out of the 23 decks, and most of them were decks such as Castro. We actually saw it in a few Sprite variants and such as well. Even Vanquish Soul was main decking it. And it's really not hard to see why. I mean, Shifter is still going to continue to be an absolute blowout against most cards, most decks, whatever you want to say, in any format. And the only thing holding the card back is just the amount of decks that can play it. Again, it's so powerful though that we're seeing decks even like Sprite and Vanquish Soul maining it of all things, just because of how good it is. I think it's going to be even like insanely stronger come the next format because of Lab and Fire King Snake Eye kind of just completely folding to the card. The only reason it's not going in high impact is because there's like less decks that can play Shifter compared to the other cards up there. But I really think that if you're playing a deck and you can afford to play Shifter, I would highly recommend it. It is going to be a blowout. So next up is going to be Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion. And so you know how I said Crow only had about 5 placings out of the 23 decks? Well, color me surprised when I found out that Bell was the second highest represented hand trap at 18 out of 23 decks either maining or siding it, which I found really strange. Like, I genuinely thought Crow would be seeing a lot more play overall, even if not more so than Bell, but I really didn't think that Bell was going to be literally everywhere right now. And I think that going into the next format, it's also a pretty damn solid card. I mean, like I talked about with the DD Crow, you can hit so many different things with Bell, including things like Fire King High Avatar Kieran, and basically everything else that Droll can hit, without being a dark or a light in order to get Bestialed in case your opponent is on Bestials. The only real downside is that it is a hard once per turn if you open multiples, but I mean, hey, I still don't really think it's that bad. But I think another interesting thing is that it does negate activation, which could prevent certain effects from going off that say, like, if you activated a card or whatever, that would do something. And now that I think about it, another really good reason to play Bell over Crow is because Runic is seeing a really high peak in popularity right now, and probably will in the next format as well, and Bell can completely shut down a Runic Fountain as opposed to Crow that can only dampen it slightly. See, I think Bell is really insane right now and will continue to be really good in the next format, whether or not you are maining or siding it. Next on the list is going to be Gamma, and Gamma had one deck playing it. It was a super heavy samurai list that actually managed to top. Yeah, TLDR, Gamma is still at 1. This card sucks now. Next on the list is going to be Ghost Mourner, and usually I do put it in Strong AF, but much like last tier list, I'm going to try not to clog up the Strong AF category by putting Ghost Mourner there. I think it's a perfectly fine card. It can absolutely snag you some wins in time, though it is always situational, especially if your deck can just play a better time card that's much easier to use. Next up is Orange Light, which didn't really see any representation. I mean, color me surprised. This card has fallen off significantly. It was already at a relatively low play rate before, but now that the Ishizu Millers are gone, there's just really very little decks and good targets to send along with it that would want to play this card, other than exactly like Drytron and Fluffle off the top of my head are the only two decks I actually see playing this card ever. So yeah, I don't really think those decks are going to be tearing up Nationals or anything, so I wouldn't really recommend it. Next on our list is Imperm, and Imperm is where things get really interesting. So Imperm had the third highest representation at 17 decks, but the thing is with Imperm is that from now to next format, the card gets significantly worse. Targeting, like, Disruption period is going to be really bad against both Lab and Snake Eye, because Snake Eye can play things like the Kieran in order to dodge it, not to mention also Circle and Skyburn if they are playing it. And it also just isn't really very impactful most of the time because they have so many different extenders and such a powerful grind game. And against Lab, I mean, if you imperm their stuff, they most likely aren't going to care anyway if you just hit the Ariana. But even then, if they really want the Ariana to go off, they can do something such as chaining a furniture piece, pitching Big Welcome, and using the Big Welcome to dodge the imperm on their Labyrinth, and then pop off any effects such as the furniture cards coming back or anything like that. So it's not really going to be as great. It's still definitely very strong against a lot of lower tier decks, and a well-timed Imperm can still technically do a lot of damage to either of those decks, mostly Snake Eyes Fire King, but it's just going to be a lot harder to get maximum value out of it compared to other decks. And again, like, we're playing in a format where there's so many things going on field and hand and grave that an Imperm as a board breaker as well is also not going to be very powerful because, I mean, what are you going to be hitting, like Amblo Whale, something like that? It just doesn't really do anything. I think Imperm as a card overall is still really strong. It's still definitely worthy of a spot in the main deck if your format that you're preparing for is going to be slightly different. But I think when it comes to going against specifically Lab and Fire King Snake Eye in high quantities, I think Imperm is not the way to go right now. And while we're on this topic, I think the same can be exactly said about Valor, and I'm going to be putting Valor in Situational, because of course Valor is going to be played in decks that want to draw a lot of cards, or that can't really afford to play Imperm for certain reasons, and so it's basically Imperm, slightly worse and more situational though, really just depends. Next on our list is Lancia, and Lancia saw a side in like Melfi Sprite, I think was one of the decks that I sampled that was playing it. But that's really it, and I don't think this card is going to be doing very much. I mean, the only thing it's really stopping is, like, Castera, which is still floating around, shockingly enough. That's really annoying. But it does stop them from, like, comboing off, so they kind of end on just, like, 2 big bodies and pass, probably. But even then, it's really not very worth it, not to mention, especially because Thrust is such a powerful card. I mean, they're just going to get a powerful card to, like, combat the Lancia anyway, or just do a lot of stuff on your turn regardless, so yeah, Lancia is really not the way to go. Next up is Mourner, and Mourner did see a couple of lists playing it, mainly because they wanted an additional hand trap that would be a decent disruption, and it's also pretty solid in time as well, but falls under the exact same thing as Imperm and Veiler. I'm going to put Ghost Mourner just under Veiler because it's slightly worse, because it is a hard once per turn, and it's a lot more niche because of like the interactions on your turn versus your opponent's turn, etc, etc. But yeah, other than that, it's like the same thing as Imperm and Veiler going into the next format. And next up we have Nibiru, and so it's not doing anything against Lab, really, that's the big thing. But against Snake Eyes Fire King, I think that Nib, especially when combined with another powerful hand trap like Ash or Bell, can just completely ruin an entire turn for that deck. It's just going to absolutely blow out everything they have on board, and especially if you time it properly before they can make a Baron or a Flamberge to get value out of it, I think it can just completely wipe out their turn. This in mind, though, they are a very grindy deck with a lot of different resources they can utilize between the graveyard, field, and hand, so they can either keep extending through it sometimes or even have things in the graveyard for follow-up. They can just use the token to probably link off into something and then make SP. Well, it technically is a bit situational because I think it is best to open with another hand trap on top of that so that they can't get that extension. I think that I'm still going to put it in the strong AF category. I think it's pretty damn powerful if you can land off a solid Nib, and I think that a lot of decks can make use out of it in the side deck right now. Next on our list is Ghost Ogre, and I mean, Ogre saw one top and out of the samples, and I don't really think it's doing anything. Ogre's big thing that it can hit this format is like specifically King's Sarcophagus, and that really feels like it's about it. And I mean, maybe hitting a princess so they don't have the link 3 to go into the Ambler Whale could be pretty funny, but other than that, I don't think Ghost Ogres are going to be like super crazy. Maybe someone can prove me wrong and just make me realize it's like a spicy tech or something though. Next is Skullmeister, and despite Skullmeister being similar to Crow and Bell overall, I think that I'm going to put it in the don't recommend category because the main thing is there's no reason to play Skullmeister over Crow or Bell. The cards are just overall significantly better and can hit so many more things because they can hit things that are targeting things in grave as opposed to things that are just activating in grave. So there's literally zero purpose other than maybe a small world bridge and like, I don't know, Madolche to play Skullmeister over either of these other cards that interact with the graveyard. And finally, we have Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, and I shit on this card a lot. I really didn't think for the longest time it was good. And I think a lot of people at the time that I was complaining about it were coping on this card because it just didn't really do much. But like between decks like the Snake Eyes Fire King stuff making a lot of linked monsters including Princess, and cards like SP Little Knight, and this card completely shutting that card down, I think that there's some potential for Phantasme to be a pretty solid side deck card. Right now, it only has the one top out of the sample size, but I think we'll probably see a lot more decks playing this because, I mean, look, it's a free body to go into your own SP. It can protect from SP with the targeting protection effect. It can dig for more extenders, hand traps, board breakers, anything like that. It can do a lot of different versatile stuff. And a lot of the time, because the summon and the draw are like at the exact same time, your opponent's going to not have a very good time with it. If you're playing a deck like Snake Eye Fire King, you can even put back bricks such as the Fire King Island if you already draw Sanctuary or like Snake Eyes Populous or something, in case you'd rather like grab them from your deck. And there's just so much that this card can do. So I'm going to put it in the strong AF category. I'm going to put it above Imperm, probably below Nib because Nib's more of a blowout. But I think that Phantasme finally has potential again, and god, it's been like 5 years since this card's been like really good. Maybe 4 if we count Dragon Link 2020 format. I think it was pretty decent then, but other than that, it's just really interesting to see this card that used to be like $100 and is now dirt cheap come back into the format after so long. And that is going to do it for my hand trap tier list post Phantom Nightmare in February of 2024. I think we're going into a pretty interesting format. I think the biggest thing is that the representation of the two decks I mentioned, especially Snake Eyes Fire King variants, are going to be insanely high, even compared to decks like Unchained and Rescue Ace and Manadium that are probably going to take a bit of a back seat. And so a lot of side decks and even main deck hand trap staples are probably going to be decided by those decks, meaning there'll probably be more of a clear-cut decision on what cards are better. Like I said, this is a bit of a preemptive list because this is coming out before Phantom Nightmare does come out. This is mostly based off current representation plus speculation. So if I end up being wrong, I tried. You can't come at me in the comments. But with that being said, what do you think about this list? Because that's going to do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like as I'll split this video and the channel into incremented. And if the content or somewhere like the rest of my tier list, I will have a board breaker tier list as always coming up to go along with this video. Then perhaps consider subscribing because we're going to 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2024. Not to mention it supports this channel more than anything else and it's absolutely free. Also be sure to hit that notification bell. Also want to support me directly while getting some awesome TCG merchandise in the process. Check out Tapio, cards in the link down below. Use code Aurora5 for 5% off your purchase at checkout and support me financially. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.